Hi guys, welcome to week 21. We're going to be going through your chapter 14 plankton PowerPoint. Now, chapter 14 is on primary producers, but I've split this into two halves so that it's a little easier for you to navigate come test time. So of course, the notes you've already taken are on plankton, and then later on this week, you're going to take the remainder of primary producers, which are going to be things like seaweed and so forth. So today we're going to go over plankton. Now, we all know what a primary producer is because we've already talked about this in our last chapter and several before then. Plus, you guys have all had biology, so we know what a primary producer does. We know these are going to be any type of animal or living thing that is able to synthesize organic materials, whether it be from photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, in order to create their own energy source. Now, in the ocean, we are going to have our main primary producers are going to be different types of plankton or phytoplankton. These are going to be photosynthetic organisms. I know we all think about plankton as being the little guy off of SpongeBob, but actually plankton are floating at the very top of the water. They are incredibly important to ocean ecosystems because they're actually going to be responsible for providing upwards of 90+% of what our ocean has in the way of carbohydrates. And the very bottom layer, which of course is that important extra energy layer that we are going to use for our food chain. So this is going to be expressed with this equation that you see there at the bottom. This is just going to be a fancy terms, grams of carbon into organic material per square meter of the ocean per year. I'm not going to make you calculate anything with it. This is just a good, important equation to know with marine science because this is how we actually could calculate the energy of all living things in the ocean, starting from that calculation there. So not a whole lot of math in marine biology, but there is a little bit. And then of course, we know that because these are going to be our primary producers, this is going to cycle all the way through them whenever we talk about our biogeochemical cycles that we covered last chapter. All of these nutrient cycles are going to go from this producer as these phytoplankton all the way back through these marine ecosystems. Now, like I said, a lot of people think about plankton as the little guy on the bottom of the ocean, but actually plankton means wandering, coming from the Greek word planktos. Now, plankton are going to be typically at the very top of the ocean. This is because this is where sunlight is, but they are going to be floating through the ocean. They do not have the capability to swim. They're going to be very small and very weak, so they're not going to be able to swim, but rather they are floating with the ocean currents, whatever direction that may be. So they are going to be consistently moving with the waves and moving with whichever direction that current is flowing. Now, as plankton, members of the community are going to interact with another. You should have already done the Secret Life of Plankton bell ringer. That is one of my favorite little videos because it's so interesting getting to see the different types of marine animal as they actually start off in that plankton phase when they're teeny, teeny, tiny. So it's essentially going to be a teeny, tiny little food chain that is not visible to us with the naked eye, but is going to be in our ocean waters. So they're going to interact with each other just like any other food chain would, even if they are teeny tiny. So there's going to be predation, there's going to be parasitism, there's going to be competition, grazing. All of this is still happening, even though they're these tiny little microscopic organisms. And like you saw in that Secret Life of Plankton, there is going to be planktonic forms of every major group of animals. Typically, this is going to be at the beginning of their life cycle because this is when they're very small and they're just starting out. And this is going to be important because, again, these are going to be one of the most true to transmission of energy. They're going to be at the very bottom of that food chain. This is going to constitute really the most important of all of our marine lives coming out of that zooplankton and that phytoplankton categories of life. So make sure you know those two, zooplankton and phytoplankton, are your most important of all of our marine communities because they are going to be the base of all aquatic food chains. Now, plankton collection. Now, the first plankton study, if you will, was carried aboard the Meteor, which we talked about back in chapter 2. This was happening back in 1925. So plankton has obviously been something that we have known about for quite a while and done many, many studies on. So the first study of it was back in 1925. Now, to catch and study plankton, it takes very specific material because they are so tiny. So obviously this is going to take more than just dipping your regular fish net into the water. So very specific nets are used to gather plankton. They're typically made of very tightly woven nylon or Dacron cloth, and they're going to be drug in the water behind large ships. If it's for a study, typically these are going to be some type of scientific vessel, which we kind of looked at the beginning of the year, what those look like. So these nets are going to be dropped into the water behind the boat, and they're going to be hauled very slowly through the top of that water. And what's important about when they're drugged for this collection purpose, they have to be drugged for a very known distance. So whether it be a mile, 2 miles, whatever the case may be, whether it's miles, kilometers, whomever is doing the study, it's important that they know exactly the distance that they've traveled and that they know exactly the depth that they've put that net into the water. So when they go to actually look at the organisms they've collected, they can say, okay, these organisms are in this region of the ocean. These organisms are at this depth of the ocean. So it's very important that scientists keep an accurate data note of that. Using this net, they will actually, I think I have some pictures on the next slide as well, that almost is a cone shape. And so what happens is all of those teeny tiny little organisms funnel down into the pointed end of the cone, which essentially just has a cup that they'll unscrew that cup, and then they'll have all these thousands of organisms in it that they can remove for analysis, put under a microscope and see what they've got. And again, very accurate data still has to be used so that they're able to determine where and how many there are. And two of the most important data readings that they have to have, of course, like I said, they have to know how far and how deep they are, but they have to know how many organisms they captured. So if they went a mile and they got 2,000 plankton types, then they have to keep a very accurate, detailed description of how many were in that area, and also the volume of water that they came out of. So make sure you know those 4 things that scientists have to keep an accurate data track of. They have to know how far the ship's gone with the net in the water, how deep the net was in the water, how many plankton they ended up gathering, and the volume of water that they came out of. Yes, here we go. So these are plankton nets. So you can see it's very, very tightly woven nets, and they are just going to drag behind the ship, and it'll funnel down into that little cup there at the bottom. And some of these, of course, are going to be bigger than others. You can see down at the very, very bottom, this is going to be a personal use plankton net. So if you just happen to decide you want to collect plankton for some reason, then they do make personal size ones. And then you have the more scientific quality ones, which are going to be much, much larger to collect a much larger sample. So it'll funnel down to that cup. They can just unscrew that sampling container, and then they can take it and stick it under a microscope and actually determine how many organisms were collected from that depth, distance, and volume of water. Now, phytoplankton. Now, autotrophic phytoplankton who generate glucose or sugars by photosynthesis, so this is how they make their energy. These are called phytoplankton. So it's just going to be a type of plankton. Now, phytoplankton are going to be what you see, or not see, but what is drifting at the top of our oceans and that very topmost sunlit layer of the water. It's an invisible mask. Every time you jump into the ocean, you are touching some type of phytoplankton. You just can't see it. Again, most just like any other type of plankton, these are going to be very critical to all life on Earth, because not only are they that important bottom contribution to our food webs, but they're also going to be one of the main contributors to oxygen and carbon dioxide in the ocean because of their photosynthesis. So without them, you wouldn't have a whole lot to breathe in as a fish species. So they're very important for the rest of the food chain, not just for food purposes. Planktonic autotrophs are thought to bind more than 50 trillion kilograms of carbon each year. This is going to be more than the rainforest. This is going to be more than any of your other subclimate forests. These are going to be more than 50% of the food made by photosynthesis every single year on Earth. So very important species, not just for in the water, but for our planet as well. Now, phytoplankton, a little bit different. Phytoplankton are going to be the tiniest of tiny, this meaning a trillionth part. So they are very, very tiny types of plankton. Obviously, they're going to be too small to be seen by a normal light microscope. So the microscopes I have here in class up there on the left are not going to be able to be used for phytoplankton. You actually have to use a very specific type of microscope to see these teeny tiny little things. They are so small to the point that there is 100 million in every liter of seawater. So think about that next time you're swimming in the ocean. Now, cyanobacteria is technically a type of phytoplankton. This is probably one of the more recognized types. This is because it is very bright when it is put underneath the ultraviolet light that is used for these specialized microscopes. And it actually is fluorescent to the point where it turns orange. So cyanobacteria is actually one of the few that are pretty visible compared to a lot of the teeny tiny species of phytoplankton. Now, estimates suggest that phytoplankton account for up to 80% of our ocean's photosynthesis, especially in the tropics, which is very important because if you'll remember from last chapter, remember those tropics are very low on nutrients because they tend to have a lot of things living in those areas. So definitely a very important species for maintaining the little bit of nutrients and oxygen that are in those oceans. Now, diatoms. Diatoms are a different type of plankton. They're going to be the second most productive type of plankton. There are more than 56,000 species of diatoms. Typically, even the larger of the species are just going to be barely visible to the unaided eye, meaning just looking at it, very, very, very difficult to see, but not nearly as small as phytoplankton. So the name diatom means to cut through. This is just a reference to the patterns that are on the cell wall. This is just going to look almost tiger striped, if you will. 55% of our sunlight is absorbed by a diatom that can be made into energy. So diatoms are actually considered to be the most efficient energy conversion producers in the entire natural world of all our primary producers, whether on land or in the ocean. Now, diatoms are going to reproduce by splitting in half and drifting apart. And this is important because diatoms, because they are going to have such a high energy conversion rate, they're able to do this as rapidly as every single day. So every single day they can split in half. So if you have a diatom and it becomes two becomes four, so on and so forth, until they are just in the water by the thousands. So diatoms, again, are going to be very, very, very energy conscious. Now, dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates are going to be a little bit different. These are typically going to be single-celled autotrophs, and you can actually even find them inside other organisms, both as a parasite and as a consumer that is going to be using that organism as a source of shelter. Now, most are going to live in free-flowing water like other plankton. They actually are built with flagella, which if you don't remember from when you had biology, is going to be almost like a little tail. This helps them to move forward and to rotate. Again, they are very weak swimmers, so they can't swim against currents. They're going to still be free floating with the water currents and the waves, but they are able to change themselves directionally. For the most part, this is significant because it allows them to get the best light. So it's where some of the types that we've already talked about just kind of have to go with the water. These dinoflagellates are actually able to adjust themselves if they're in a shady spot or if they are starting to sink to the bottom or wave forces pushing down on them. They're actually able to adjust themselves a little bit into that current that they're flowing with in order to get back into the sunshine so that they can make the best photosynthetic use of the light in the area. Now, phytoplankton, which are again, going to be specifically into dinoflagellates, can actually be strongly bioluminescent. Now, if you don't know what the word bioluminescent means, bioluminescent is just going to mean they can glow. So in scientific terms, this is going to be the process by which energy from a chemical reaction is transformed into light energy. So whenever they do their photosynthesis or their chemosynthesis, in this case, most likely photosynthesis, they're actually able to turn that energy and radiate light out from their bodies. This is a chemical process that takes place inside of them. So some dinoflagellates are able to use this bioluminescence in the darker hours of the evening. This is going to help them whenever that sunlight is no longer with them and able to produce that photosynthetic glow that they need. So some dinoflagellates, and these specifically are going to be very prominent here in the Gulf of Mexico. We have this problem, but they can actually become so numerous that they can create what is called a HAB, or a harmful algae bloom. So this is where the water is actually going to turn a very rusty red. Sometimes it can be green, sometimes it can be orange. And they are actually going to be overwhelming the water source that they're in. Typically, this is going to be because of land runoff, but it can vary. So this is what an HAB looks like. Now, I picked three pictures, and I know it said that they can turn the water red, but these 3 pictures are actually out of Florida. And typically when we have harmful algae blooms in this region of the world, they're actually going to be green in color. And I recommend you actually hop on YouTube and you can see harmful algae blooms, Florida. And I believe the last time we had one was 2018, if I'm not mistaken. But what happens is we have a lot of runoff specifically from farmland that are using pesticides and chemicals to do their crops. This sinks into the ground. That groundwater, of course, is going to leak into rivers and is all going to go back into the ocean. And when it does, all of this groundwater is taking with it all of those extra chemicals and pesticides and nutrients even. And when that hits the water, these dinoflagellates are going to feed off of all those extra chemicals and all those extra nutrients. And this causes them to have a bloom, which essentially just means that they're reproducing quicker, they're multiplying at speeds that are not natural because they have all this extra nutrients that they're able to survive in larger numbers. And when they do, because they're actually sitting on the surface of the water and they are visible, they're actually going to create this film, which in this case, in Florida's case, is typically going to be green, that will literally just sit right on top of the water. Now, the problem with this is not only does it turn the water a gross color, but it also is going to cover the top of the water. So any sunlight that hits our ocean is not going to get past this blanket, essentially, of dinoflagellates. So if you have seaweed on the bottom of the ocean under this blanket, it's all pretty much going to die because it's not able to reach the seaweed and they're not able to produce photosynthesis and essentially feed themselves, which then breaks down your food chain because now you don't have something for your primary producer or consumers to eat, and then your secondary. A lot of the times they're also toxic. This is the problem we have with the one in the Gulf of Mexico, is a lot of times we have to shut down fishing or crab catching in these areas because these harmful algae blooms, these dinoflagellates, actually have toxins in them. PSP is one. This is paralytic shellfish poisoning. This is typically what you'll see in oysters, sometimes scallops, where these dinoflagellates are actually poisoning the animals that live in there. Most of the time the fish just die, but shellfish tend to be pretty well reserved within able to handle it. But then they have those toxins in them. So then when we take them out of the ocean and we eat them, these toxins often aren't able to be cooked out or are killed with high heat. So we're then ingesting them and then we get sick. So dinoflagellates are important, but they can also be very harmful in too large of numbers. Now, Coccolithosaurs, these are going to be kind of similar to dinoflagellates, but a little bit different. And I'm going to explain to you why. So they're going to be small, not nearly as small as our pico, but they are going to be visible to the eye. Now, these are essentially going to be plankton types, but they're actually got a fancy little disc on top of their bodies, and you can look up what they look like. And this is going to be fixed to the outside of their walls. So it's almost going to look like they have a little sun hat on, if you will. Now, these translucent coverings are actually going to act as the sun hat for these things. That's actually going to present a shade for them so they don't actually absorb too much sunlight, because these species of plankton tend to be in areas that are getting high levels of light. And remember, last chapter we talked about it's important that they don't get too much light, otherwise they could be unsuccessful. And if it's not the right quality of light, then they can also have some issues. And we'll mention that here in a little bit as well. So these are typically going to live in those brightly lit areas, and because they have their sunshade, they tend to be safely able to work in these areas where other plankton types wouldn't be able to. Now, a good example of this is the Mediterranean. Now, in these areas, they can actually do similar to the dinoflagellates, where they get so numerous that they cause the water to turn green. In this case, they'll actually turn the water kind of not white, but almost milky or chalky, kind of hazy looking. And this is because they all have those discs on top of them. So when you have a large amount of them on the water, it tends to turn the water the same color as all of those discs, excuse me, on the tops of their head. So this is kind of what they look like. And I like to include these pictures. They're actually from space. You can see how bright they are, even though they're tiny little plankton. Millions and billions and trillions of them actually can turn entire oceans this color, just because they're so numerous and because they have those little discs on the top of their head. So this is what happens when you have a bloom of Cotylospores. Now, the difference between these and HABs, these are not toxic. You can swim in these, they're not going to be a problem. They're not going to poison the fish. Because it is translucent, sun can still penetrate. So that's the difference between your HAB and your Cotylospores. Even though they can alter color, these aren't going to be detrimental like your HABs would be, or your dinoflagellates. Now, moving on, going a little bit into primary productivity. So of course, we all know that they require the four main ingredients to produce their carbs. We talked about this last chapter. So they need water, carbon dioxide, excuse me, inorganic nutrients, and sunlight. Of course, these are going to be all of the case for your photosynthesis to occur. Now, water is not a limiting factor, which we talked about limiting factors as well. So remember, a limiting factor is something that if you have too much or too little of it, it can affect the success of the organism. Water is obviously not going to be a limiting factor. They're in the ocean. They have plenty of water. They can't have too much water. Water is just a part of it. So this doesn't really affect them as much as it would maybe a land plant that could get too much water. Now, carbon dioxide is never really a limiting factor either, because carbon dioxide is highly soluble in ocean water. So there's going to be plenty of it. So this means what you're really left with is the two limiting factors being nutrients and then sunlight. So just like with any other living thing, if they don't have enough sunlight, obviously as photosynthetic organisms, they're not going to be able to produce the energy that they need to survive. And then of course, nutrients, if they don't have those inorganic nutrients, excuse me, then they're not going to be able to produce moving up forward into that food chain. So non-conservative nutrients, these are going to be, again, they are considered a limiting factor, but they are going to be nutrients that change in concentration with the biological activity. So for example, breaking this down a little easier to understand, if you have a period of rapid phytoplankton growth, so let's say an HAB, a harmful algal bloom, these ocean waters are going to be so seriously depleted of their non-conservative nutrients because now there's been so many plankton that have eaten up all these nutrients, there's nothing left. And eventually everything's just going to die off. And all of the nutrients that are found in other organisms are going to have been eaten by the predators, but now we have no primary producers to replenish that. So when these organisms die, unfortunately, their bodies are going to sink down into that sunlit zone where these primary producers aren't going to have access to them. And this is going to cause lower nutrients. So unless you have something like the upwelling that you get from deep water into sunlit zones, they're really going to be out of luck. So if you have an area where those nutrients have been depleted pretty heavily, then you're going to have an area where you're not going to have a whole lot of phytoplankton productivity. So Like I said, we do get a lot of HABs in Florida. We tend to get them every 2-3 years pretty regularly, typically in the Gulf, just because that is a inlet area that tends to have a lot of nutrients swirling in gyres in there. And what happens is every few years we'll have an HAB and we'll have to postpone fishing, shellfish fishing specifically. And then all of the nutrients will be depleted. The HAB will die off. We'll have about a year of regrowth and then everything will be normal. And then once again, once we have all those nutrients back in the water, we'll have another HAB. So it tends to be a cycle that we experience here in Florida pretty regularly. Now, again, light can also be limiting. So again, if nutrients aren't present, productivity is going to rely on illumination because these are photosynthesizers. So of course, if you are a photosynthesizer, too little light is going to be damaging because obviously you don't have enough to do photosynthesis, but actually too much light can also be inhibiting, like I had said earlier. It's not necessarily getting all of the light or being where the light is the brightest, especially because too much light can overwhelm a lot of photosynthesizers. Like we talked about the Coccolithophores with the hats that they have on their body shape that allow them to collect enough, but not too much. So especially with types of diatoms, it's not about being in the brightest place in the world to photosynthesize. It's more so about quality than quantity. So the quality of the light that they're getting, meaning their wavelength, is going to be very important to how successful they are. So because most photosynthesizers are going to have chlorophyll, which we know is the green pigment that gives them their color, this means it's best going to absorb red or violet wavelength, which we talked about a couple chapters back, is typically only going to be found at the very topmost parts of the ocean, hence why we see our plankton species here. And at certain depths, these carbohydrates that they produce during photosynthesis and oxygen are going to exactly break even. So what I mean is what they're producing is the same thing as what they are taking in. And this break even depth is called the composition depth. So this is where they need to be. This is that happy place of they're getting just enough light at a good quality. They're not getting too much. There's not too much nutrients. There's just enough. And so everything they're taking in is exactly what they're putting out. So this is called the composition depth. And this is where really they're all shooting to be at. All right, so this is just a easier way to kind of look at some of the areas that you're going to find good phytoplankton productivity. So again, this is going to have a lot to do with light and nutrients. Now, because of coastal upwelling and land runoff, like we already talked about with our HABs, nutrients are going to be the highest near the continents. Make sure you know that. Continents are going to have a lot of that runoff, whether it be from nutrients coming from farms or coming off of mountains, out of rivers, whatever the case may be. When you have ice that melts, this is going to cause upwelling. So plankton are going to be the most abundant near these continents because productivity is the highest. Now, some other high productivity areas are going to be tropical coral reefs. Typically, they're able to live in these areas because these are going to be your species that are living in other organisms. And being inside other organisms, there's no better place to find them than coral reefs, where you have lots of different species to choose from. The poles, in the summer only, they will travel. In the summer, again, you have ice that's melting, specifically glaciers and ice caps. And when they do, it causes that upwelling. So all of that nutrients that we talked about sunk to the bottom of the ocean where they couldn't get it before has now been pushed back up to the top. So they're able to access it and use it for their own productivity. And then temperate continental shelves, this is again going to be near those continents. And this is going to be where you're going to have your most dependable light at a good quality with moderate nutrients to sustain a decent amount of life without having an overflowing bloom. Now, some low productivity areas, tropical oceans, much like the rest of the live tropical oceans, they have very, very high sunlight to the point where it's overwhelming, and low nutrients because it is all being taken by those currents, and you have a lot of species that are in competition for it. The poles in the winter, of course, we know that during the winter in the poles, you are going to have very little sunlight, if any at all, for some days at a time. So they're not going to be able to photosynthesize. And there's also going to be very low nutrients because you don't have that ice melting to create that upwelling. And then finally, in the open ocean, there's little sources to upwell nutrients. You're not getting any kind of runoff. You have heavy storms in these areas, so it's not going to provide a very stable home for that phytoplankton productivity. All right, so that is it. Short and sweet, does it? That is the first portion of your chapter 14. Again, you're going to be taking the second portion, which is going to be on the rest of your primary producers, which is very short, very easy, later on in the week, and I will have a video for that as well. You guys have a wonderful week, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to email me. Bye, guys.